G'day guys, and welcome back to the channel. So if you own a 200 series Land Cruiser and take it out to the highway, or perhaps tow a small trailer or even a large caravan for that matter, you may be aware of the stock transmission's difficulty in switching into and remaining in 6th gear. So in today's video, we're going to talk about a number of topics surrounding the stock transmission and the known issue, and talk about whether it actually is an issue or not. Today's video, we're going to talk about how the vehicle determines its gears, why it chooses not to use 6th gear, conduct a road test, analyze some of those results, talk about some of the modifications I've conducted on my 200 series to improve the drivability, and why you might not want to force your vehicle into that 6th gear. So park up and let's shift straight into today's episode. So I think it's fair to say, and it's common knowledge, that these Land Cruiser 200 series have a difficulty within selecting and remaining within that top 6th gear, but is it really a big issue like some people make it out to be? Now, a quick note before we start, please don't confuse this advice with towing gear recommendations. There are some specific factors that you have to take into account when you are towing, but this video is just going to be explaining and demonstrating why the gearbox behaves as it does and why it does and doesn't use that top 6th gear. So the vehicle has been designed to perform at its peak performance through varying circumstances, driving conditions, terrains and environments. It has to balance and manage all aspects of the vehicle, and with the transmission just being one part of the overall machine. So the onboard computers within this vehicle are going to be trying to combine the peak performance with best reliability and best fuel economy. This explains the hundreds of sensors throughout the vehicle. These sensors provide up-to-date information to the ECU every second the vehicle is running. Whether or not it be air-fuel ratios, how the intake air temperature affects the oxygen levels, thermostat settings, engine temperature, or what gear the vehicle is in, it's all part of a bigger picture. So when you accelerate, the vehicle is taking hundreds of calculations into account to choose the best gear to maximize efficiency for your driving style. If you were to accelerate gently, the vehicle is going to slowly change up those gears and provide you a nice, smooth and comfortable ride. However, if you bury your foot down on that accelerator pedal, it's going to downshift, spool that boost, increase the RPM, and it's going to put the power out. So let's talk about how the physics of a gearbox works and what is going on underneath the vehicle. Without going into full detail about the inner workings of a transmission, what you do need to understand is that the difference between an automatic and a manual gearbox are inherently different in their design. A manual gearbox comprises of a lay shaft, or a shaft that runs parallel to the main drive shaft and carries the gear set, whereby an automatic transmission, like the 200 series here, uses a combination of ring and planetary gears to control that output speed. Now, if you're driving a 200 series Land Cruiser with an automatic transmission like this one at the same speed, it doesn't matter whether you're in 4th, 5th or 6th gear, the output shaft from the gearbox is going to be turning at the same speed. The input shaft coming from the rear of the engine is going to be turning at different speeds, and so are the gears within the transmission. Now, if you're dropping down a gear, you're going to be increasing the RPM, right? Well, as you increase that RPM, the torque levels drop on the gear sets within the transmission. So let's use an example to illustrate this. Say the example of a push bike. Now on a push bike, the rider would represent the engine, the cogs or the gears would be the transmission, and the chain representing the driveline. Now, if you were to ride this bike up a hill at a constant speed in a low gear, say first, the cadence or the RPM of the rider's legs would be increased. However, the effort or the load that the rider is placed under would decrease. This would mean that the gear set and the chain would be spinning at a faster rate, but the torque placed on those components would be significantly less. Now, if you get that same bike on the same hill and ride it at the same speed, but switch it into, say, 5th gear, you'll notice that the RPM or the cadence of the rider's legs would slow down significantly, but the force required or the effort placed on the rider would increase significantly. Again, the gear set or the cogs and the chain would be moving at a slower rate, but the torque placed on those components would be increased significantly. Now, this example can be compared with the transmission in the Land Cruiser 200 series. The vehicle is still trying to make that decision between the peak performance, best reliability and best fuel economy. If the vehicle chooses a gear that is too high, the RPM will be too low, and that will place more load and stress in the form of torque on the engine and gearbox components. But on the other hand, if the gear is too low, the RPM will be too high, and in most cases we'll look at increased fuel consumption. So the vehicle is always trying to take these and balance these factors, take them into consideration and choose the best gear that is going to suit your driving style. So with this in mind, and observing that Toyota designed this vehicle with a 6-speed automatic gearbox, why doesn't the standard tune use the 6th gear and hold within it? Well, the answer is simple. It just simply doesn't run in its most efficient state. In Australia, generally our maximum speed limits on the highway and the open roads is 110 kilometers an hour. If you look at my vehicle at 110 kilometers an hour in 6th gear, I'm running at about 16 to 1700 RPM, whereby in 5th gear, I'm running at about 2100 RPM. Now I know after having this vehicle dynoed that the max torque that I get out of this vehicle is achieved at 2200 RPM. So we can see here the vehicle is trying to utilize that maximum torque in 5th gear, which is much closer to that peak performance, to get the vehicle moving in its most efficient state. Now, this isn't to say that 6th gear is never used. There are going to be circumstances where it is more efficient, and in that time I would expect it to select 6th gear. However, generally and in most circumstances with a modified vehicle, 5th gear is going to be the solution. So this is all well and great for vehicles that are rolling off the Toyota manufacturing line and stock form. After all, Toyota have put in millions of dollars of research and development into getting these calculations and at maximum efficiency ratings correct. But then someone like me comes along. I modify my vehicle with bigger suspension, bigger tires, ruin the aerodynamics of the vehicle by adding accessories all over it, and add significant amounts of weight. Combine this with sometimes towing heavy loads, all these factors are going to have a significant difference or change, an impact upon how the gearbox chooses the correct gear and what sort of condition it runs in. So there's two things that I've done to my Land Cruiser to try and improve the drivability of the Cruiser given all these modifications and changes I've made. So the first thing I did was install a stock lock torque converter lockup kit. Now I've done a full video on this kit, how it works and what it does, and I'll put a link up here and also one in the description below if you're interested in looking at that one. Although it has some effect on the gear selection process, it doesn't directly correlate to selecting different gears. Now the second thing that I've done to my Cruiser is it had a transmission tune, or sometimes referred to as a remap. This has done a couple of things to the transmission. First of all, it's altered the shift points and the torque tolerances throughout each gear. And the second thing it's done is also changed the line pressures within the transmission, resulting in quicker shifts. Now I'll go into remaps and line pressures in a future video. However, the main thing is we've altered those torque tolerances and the shift points. Altering the shift points is going to negate things like the bigger tires, which throws the RPM out of whack, and these alterations try and bring that back to a more standard form. So what we need to understand is that each gear has a torque tolerance. We can see that in the form of the load placed upon the engine when you're in that certain gear, and on this vehicle we can see it on the ultra gauge. Once that load gets too high on the ultra gauge, the vehicle is going to downshift, choose a lower gear to reduce the load placed on the engine and therefore continue the acceleration process or the coasting process. So altering those torque tolerances means anything over 95 kilometers an hour, unless I'm accelerating hard, this vehicle is going to be in 6th gear. Now for some reason, this is what people want. There is this desire for Land Cruiser owners to select within and remain within that top 6th gear, but not for me. We've spoken a little bit about how and why the Land Cruiser 200 series chooses a particular gear in different driving scenarios, but now it's time to talk about why I don't like forcing my vehicle into that top 6th gear. Now the first reason is one that we've already covered on in this video, and that is the increased strain that is placed upon the engine and transmission. As we choose that higher gear, the load of the strain is placed directly onto the engine and transmission in the form of torque. Now having that higher load and higher strain on those components is going to increase wear and tear throughout the life of the vehicle and could result in a premature failure. In addition to that, altering the torque tolerances on my gearbox has been a bit of a double negative in my circumstance. This is in combination with already adding increased torque on my vehicle in the form of larger tires, added weight and bad aerodynamics. Now to say that there's increased wear and tear on the transmission and the engine components is a bit of a throwaway line, but let's talk about exactly how that works and why it does increase some of the wear and tear on these components. So in the form of the transmission in a Land Cruiser 200 series being an AB60F model, we have a series of planetary and ring gears that engage in different combinations to allow us to move from gears 1 to 6 and reverse. These are controlled by a computer controlled module and different orientations of clutch packs within that transmission, which will activate those gears as requested. So for example, on this Cruiser here, first gear has a ratio of 3.333. What this means that is the input shaft coming into the gearbox from the rear of the engine here is spinning 3.333 times for every single rotation of the output shaft of the gearbox. What this allows is maximum torque and higher movement within the engine to get the vehicle off from a stationary position. Now, changing the orientation of those clutch packs will engage different ring gears and planetary gears within the transmission, and this will activate second gear. As we see here, second gear will reduce that ratio down to 1.96, and again that means that the input shaft coming into the transmission is moving at 1.96 rotations for every one rotation of the output shaft. Now if we have a look at the full ratios for the Land Cruiser 200 series, you'll see here that this figure gets lower and lower. This is what allows us to drive at faster speeds but maintain that lower RPM. So what we can see from this list here is in 6th gear, we have a ratio of 0.588, which means that our input shaft is spinning slower than the rate of the output shaft. But what's also interesting to note is our 4th gear has a 1-to-1 ratio, which is also known as direct drive. This means that our input shaft, intermediate shaft within the transmission, and the output shaft are all spinning at the same rate. Having all these shafts move at the same rate means there is no movement or engagement of those ring and planetary gears as they're all spinning as one, and this is where we get our reduced wear and tear. Not only do we get that reduced wear and tear, but we also have the maximum strength within the gearbox and the reduction of any loss of power in the form of heat, so providing maximum efficiency. So now we've spoken about some of the effects it has on the transmission and how it might increase the wear and tear there, but what about the engine? How exactly is it going to put that strain on the engine, and what effects will this have? Well, this is where we can do some real-world side-by-side testing with access to things like engine temperature, EGTs, and engine load. So now we're going to go out and test the vehicle in different gears. We're going to be doing a couple of different tests. The first one is a 110 km/h run over a 10 km period on a relatively flat road. We're going to run this in both 5th and 6th gear and see what effect this has on some of those engine vitals. We're then going to move into some hillier terrain, although not extreme, and just see what difference that makes, again running in both 5th and 6th gear at 110 km/h. So for these tests, we're going to be driving the vehicle unladen. It is not going to be towing anything, there's no bulky items on the roof rack, and it's going to be empty inside apart from your usual gear. We're also going to be utilising cruise control to maintain the best possible constant speed between both the tests. We'll also do the tests on the same day, back-to-back runs on the same section of road in the same direction to try and keep everything else as consistent as possible. So let's hit the road and see how we go. So we're going to start with our flat road 110 km/h test. Like I mentioned, they will run over a period of 10 kilometers, taking roughly 6.5 minutes to complete. Now I've inputted data from the gear selection, the RPM, the engine load, the engine temperature, EGT, and speed at 10-second intervals to gather a snapshot of the results. To show the constants will remain the same for each test, here you can see that the speeds were almost identical on both runs. The average moving speeds for both tests were exactly 107 km/h. The second data set we can observe is the RPM. This graph shows the 6th gear test in blue, and we can see that the average RPM at 110 km/h was 1689. The green line represents our 5th gear test, and the average RPM was 2113. Moving on to some of the important data we came here to see, starting with the engine load. The vehicle measures the engine load in a percentage format, 0 being off and 100% being maximum capability. The engine idle will generally sit between 18 and 20%. Given the limited data intervals obtained here, the graph display is turbulent. Again, the blue line depicted in the 6th gear and the green the 5th, the visual graph doesn't easily display the overall loads. However, averaging the data during the 110 km sections in 6th gear achieved 47% and 5th gear 39%. So we have seen an 8% decrease in the load placed upon the engine. Moving on to engine temperatures, and here we can see that I've made a small mistake by not allowing the vehicle to cool down adequately before starting that 5th gear test. This has caused some interference with the first third of the results. Overall, the 6th gear averaged 83 degrees and the 5th gear 84 degrees. However, if we remove the outliers and starting from the 132nd mark, both tests ran at an average of 83 degrees for this test. Lastly, moving on to EGTs, or exhaust gas temperatures. Again, being the same run as the previous test, I've not allowed those initial temps to match the first test, but nonetheless, we can see the consistent result in this graph. Averaging the results after the 52nd mark, which is when we reach those 110 km/h speeds, the average EGT for the 6th gear test is 375 degrees, whereas the fifth gear test is 346 degrees. To put this into perspective on the graph, at the 270-second mark, the temperatures were 383 in sixth and 357 in fifth. Given that these temperatures don't fall below 165 degrees at idle, considering the day's conditions, this represents a 12% decrease in temps. So I know there's going to be people out there looking at that data going, well, the differences between fifth and sixth gear are negligible. They're so small, it doesn't really matter which gear you're in, and none of that data has any cause for concern, and to that I say I agree. But if the Land Cruiser is going to utilise sixth gear at any time, that test would be the perfect scenario. Flat road, high speed, unladen vehicle, not towed, with nothing bulky on the roof, and that's when I hope it would utilise sixth gear. But nevertheless, we still see that there was a very small increased load placed upon the engine either way. So with this in mind, let's move to our second test out in that hillier terrain, or slightly more undulating terrain, but what you will see is it's a little bit harder to keep the constants the same due to an increased volume of traffic, but I've done my best. Let's see how those results turned out. Now again, starting with the speed, you can see that midway during this test, I was slowed by traffic and tried to maintain this on the second test. However, the sixth gear run did have a slightly faster moving average at 103 kilometers an hour compared to the fifth gear at 100 kilometers an hour. The RPM data corroborates the gear selections used in the testing, blue being the sixth gear with a lower RPM and green being the fifth gear with a higher RPM. The engine load is again turbulent and hard to read on a visual graph like this. However, when we take the average moving loads, we get 55% for the sixth gear test and 41% for the fifth gear test. So now we can start to see a little bit more of a difference. Just introducing some gentle hills and an overtaking lane, the difference in average engine loads has increased from 8% on the flat road test to 14% difference in this test. So let's move on to the engine temps. I managed to get consistent starting temperatures for this test this time round. The blue line representing the sixth gear is noticeably higher throughout most of the test, but particularly around the 270 to 310 second mark, which was an uphill overtaking lane. The average for the sixth gear test was 87 degrees and the fifth gear 85. Again, not a massive difference overall, but at the peak of the sixth gear test, the engine temps were 92, whereas the peak of the fifth gear was only 88. Lastly, moving on to our EGT's data. Once we're up to a constant and comparable speed, we can again observe the sixth gear test to run hotter over the run. The sixth gear EGT averaged 414 degrees, while the fifth gear test averaged 371, giving a difference of 40 degrees over that 10-kilometer test. Now, just like in the engine temperature, we have seen a jump here in the difference of only 29 degrees in our flat road test to 40 degrees by introducing these hills. There we have it, that's our second test done, and I can already hear the comments coming saying that again the difference was too small and negligible, and the difference between fifth and sixth gear really doesn't matter. All of that load data and temperature data was all well within safe operating ranges and safe to run over a prolonged period of time. But again, remember, this vehicle is unladen. There's nothing in it, nothing on the roof, and we're not towing, but we still saw the difference in the test results. What this test does show us, though, that there is an undoubtedly increased load placed upon the engine and the transmission in the form of torque while driving in those higher gears. And we can see just by our environmental conditions and the hilly terrain we're driving upon, this increases those results significantly. What we can draw from this is that modifying these cruisers and changing them way that came from factory by adding larger tyres and roof racks and bull bars that affect the aerodynamics and all the extra weight that we put on them is definitely going to alter the way in which the factory gearbox and transmission selects those gears. And this is where people are going to come a little bit unstuck. So trying to force a modified loaded Land Cruiser, and if you're towing something like a 3.5 ton caravan into a top gear while driving, is almost definitely going to send some of these temperatures and load ratings well and truly outside of their safe operating temperatures for prolonged periods, and this may result in premature wear and tear and maybe even failure. So it's just something you have to keep in mind, and something I'll revisit once we've got our new van attached to this and we can do some real world testing. So there we have it, guys. That is why the 200 series transmission behaves like it does. And it's not because your Land Cruiser's got an issue or the Toyota have got it wrong. It's just because it doesn't run as efficiently as possible in that top gear. Now, this is not to discount or discredit some of the frustration that comes with the constant changing of gears at highway speeds, sometimes referred to as hunting. But there are things you can do about that, and perhaps we'll talk about that in a future video. But if there's one thing you take away from this video, is just be aware of what your vehicle is doing. If you have a stock vehicle, then leave it in drive and let the gearbox choose the best gear for your driving situation, and trust that the Toyota engineering department have got it right. If you have a modified cruiser like this one, and perhaps you're towing a very heavy load, and then again, just be aware of what's going on. Keep an eye on the engine vitals like your loads, your temperatures, and your EGTs, and this is where a device like the Ultra Gauge comes in very, very handy. So check out the link in the description below to watch that video. But I will say it again, like I did at the start of the video, this is not advice for towing gear recommendations, as there's different factors you have to take into account for, well, specifically for towing. This is just a video to explain and demonstrate how and why the transmission behaves like it does. So guys, I hope you managed to get some value from the video today, and I hope it managed to get you thinking about some of the stresses that you may be placing on your engine, driveline, and transmission when you're towing or putting these vehicles under some heavy duty situations. But guys, thanks for watching all the way to the end, and we'll see you in the next episode. Cheers.